they feel that anger is necessary for social change. But Seneca says that that's not true at all, and that when you become angry, you lose your sense of rationality.
Hello, friends, and welcome back to the Strong Stoic Podcast. I am your host, Brandon Tumblin, and today I have the privilege of talking with David Fideler. David is the author of the book Breakfast with Seneca, a Stoic guide to the art of living. Okay, so obviously this is all about Seneca's philosophy, Seneca the Stoic, and Seneca wrote a lot of different books, and so David sort of goes over all of his main teachings in a very readable fashion. I've really enjoyed the book, and I really enjoyed talking with him. We talk about, of course, Seneca. We talk about politics and much, much more. I really hope you enjoy it. Please welcome David Fideler. David, thank you so much for joining me. How's it going? How's your day going?
Good. It's great being with you. So wonderful to be on your podcast, Brandon.
Yeah, I'm really excited to talk to you. I've been really digging your book there, Breakfast with Seneca. And I know I just told you this joke when we were talking, but I'm going to say it again. You've been having breakfast with Seneca. I've been having breakfast with you and Seneca here lately. So that was kind of funny. So one of the big topics I wanted to touch with you on, and I think this is going to take a bit of time, and I'm really interested to get into this with you, is whether or not Seneca was actually a Stoic.
Okay.
And I know this is probably a confusing question for maybe some people who, they know Seneca, they know he's a Stoic author, and they read all of his books. But let me, I guess, preface this with saying he's been criticized in the past for a few reasons. He's been criticized because he was associated with Emperor Nero, who was just a terrible, terrible, murderous person, especially near the end of his reign. And so Seneca was sort of a politician in that, or he was associated with him in that regard. And so he gets a little bit of pushback for that, like, why didn't you stand up to this tyrant a bit more, so to speak? And then the other reason he gets a bit of pushback, not as much, but he's really intellectually free. And he's not afraid to go against the grain in terms of the ancient Stoic philosophy, right? And you'll see him from time to time, he'll venture out into potentially unstoic areas. And so there's a little bit of pushback in terms of his actual writing. Most people agree that his writing is very Stoic, but he tends to get a bit of pushback on that. So just based on your research and how you've, obviously you have a book about him, what do you think? Do you think we can consider Seneca a Stoic?
Well, he certainly considered himself to be a Stoic. I mean, he refers to himself as being a Stoic, and he writes about Stoic philosophy, so I think he's definitely a Stoic. So there was some claims of hypocrisy against him during his lifetime because he was so wealthy. And of course, he actually responded to those charges of hypocrisy at the end of a short little essay he wrote called On the Happy Life. And he did actually a very good job of defending himself, I believe. After all, if you were a Stoic, it would be normal. They would consider wealth to be an advantage and something that you should actually want to have if possible. And one of the explanations that Seneca gives is that if you have wealth, then you can use it to exercise your virtue. So people oftentimes, the way that people respond to wealth depends really on their character. So some people, if they were to become suddenly wealthy, would be sort of like psychologically overwhelmed by it and not know how to use it wisely. But there are other people who are extremely wealthy who use their wealth wisely, and they live pretty frugal lifestyles. I mentioned a story in the book about an old friend of mine who lived next door to me when I lived in the United States in Michigan, and he was quite wealthy. He owned a engineering company that did $220 million in sales a year, and I think it's about triple that now. But I walked over to his house one day, and it had a very beautiful view, but it was very modest on the inside. It had like this rustic interior, and we sat there having coffee, and he started telling me about the different types of philanthropy that he engaged in and the different programs. One program, which he was very proud of, I think justifiably, is he created a training program to get people off of welfare. And he got 30 people off of welfare and gave them permanent jobs, which is something the government wasn't able to do. So he took that upon himself. And when we were sitting there, he said that one of the things that I think about the most is how we could eliminate poverty in the world. So this very wealthy guy, very down to earth, and he gave, tens of millions of dollars to the local community. So wealth obviously can be used for good purposes, and it all comes down to really whether or not you're a virtuous person. And as far as Seneca and his involvement with Nero, well, Seneca had a lot of bad luck, actually, because he was a senator under Caligula, Claudius, and Nero, and he had problems with all of them. So the problem is that there's no question that Nero was not a virtuous person. There's no question about that. But then none of these other figures were either. And they were all involved in, killing people that they feared might steal their power, or something like that. And Caligula supposedly wanted to put Seneca to death because Seneca gave a very high-quality speech in the Senate, and Caligula was jealous of it. And then Seneca was chronically ill with a lung condition, which seems to have been tuberculosis and asthma. And one of Nero's mistresses said, well, don't put Seneca to death. He's going to die soon anyway. So Seneca got out of that. Now, assuming that story is true, because a lot of these stories that come down, that has sort of the ring of truth to it, but a lot of these stories that come down to us from the ancient world are just stories, and we don't have any way to evaluate their accuracy. This is something I've been thinking a lot about recently. For example, like a lot of the stories in Diogenes Laertius' Lives of the Eminent Philosophers. So it's a compilation of stories of ancient philosophers and their views. But most people don't really realize this. That particular compilation was not put together until after the death of Marcus Aurelius. So whatever he's saying in there, for example, about the life of Zeno, the founder of Stoicism, that's like 500 years earlier. And sometimes he lists sources that he's using, but sometimes even the sources are in conflict. So, there are a lot of famous stories, for example, like Zeno went to visit the Delphic Oracle and all of that. We don't really know if that's true or not. It's a good story. There are conflicting stories about his shipwreck as well, and whether it even happened, which, people overlook, but they're all there in Diogenes. He says, X, Y, and Z gives this story, and then this other person gives, this other story. So people have to be very careful about these ancient sources because they're not historical. They're not histories in the way that we would consider histories today. The first modern history was actually written in the 1400s in the Renaissance, and what made it a modern history is that the author of it, whose name was Leonardo Bruni, took a critical look and analyzed the value of the sources he was drawing upon. And before that, people didn't do that. So when you look at a work like Diogenes Laertius, it's sort of like a garbage bin where all of the existing material and stories, they're like thrown in there uncritically, and then he just repeats them, and so-and-so says this, so-and-so says that. So it's very hard to evaluate the validity of those stories. Now, actually, very luckily, it seems that his account of Stoic ideas is quite accurate. more so than like some of the other philosophical schools. It seems to be pretty reliable. But as for, the stories about the actual people, I'm not so sure, because one of the reasons those stories were repeated is because people saw them as having a moral value, for example, like Bible stories or something like that. So I think people should maybe think about them a little more along those lines. But the sources for Seneca's life are actually quite sparse, and they should be questioned more than they are, because there's actually no one who has given us an account of Seneca who actually knew Seneca in a first-hand, way that has come down to us. There's not a single report about Seneca from someone who personally knew him. And the earliest real source about Seneca is the Annals of Tacitus, which was written decades after Seneca died. And the other one is by Cassius Dio, who's also known as Dio Cassius. But whatever you want to call him, I think that one is just incredibly unreliable, and that's well over 100 years after Seneca died, and it just contains crazy stuff like this. One of my favorite lines is that Seneca he owned 500 tables made out of fine woodwork and ebony for the wild parties that he used to host, and I find that highly doubtful. I don't think that Bill Gates owns 500 wooden tables with ebony legs.
Right.
So,
yeah,
a lot of these things, of course, if you are a wealthy and powerful person like Seneca was, you're likely to attract a lot of criticism, but there's just really almost no way to evaluate these different accounts like that.
That's interesting. I didn't know that there was no firsthand information about that, because I was just thinking like how most people would describe politicians today. Maybe this is something of a decent comparison, because we all see politicians on TV. We see their 15-second clip, and we see the decisions they make, and we criticize their decisions, but we don't really know who they are, and that works against us probably much more than it works for us, right?
Right.
Right. For them, they put off a face, but for us, we don't really see the person behind it. And actually, as a quick side note, I think podcasting is a great way to address that, because you see politicians now and senators are starting to find their way onto podcasts. And so now you get the chance to hear someone talk for an hour, 2 hours, 3 hours on hand. And that's such a great way of getting an idea of who the person is. And it'd be interesting. I'd love to hear a 3-hour conversation of Seneca with someone else.
Oh, exactly. Yeah. Another aspect of this comes down to due process as well, because if people make charges against someone, there should be some due process involved. But if they're in these ancient sources that were written, like 150 years after Seneca died, he obviously can't defend himself. And again, we just don't have any idea what sources they were drawing upon.
Yeah.
When it comes to Seneca. Now, in other cases, sometimes we do, because Tacitus will list his sources and things like that. But I don't believe he doesn't give any sources for, the stories about Seneca. But
yeah,
obviously some of those things are true. Nero killed his mother, he killed his brother, and we know that he went on to kill Seneca and actually all the other members of Seneca's family. But the early Stoics, the Greek Stoics, said that if you were a Stoic, you should participate in politics unless there's something to prevent you from doing that. And Seneca was actually the only one who did that except for Marcus Aurelius. And if he was going to participate in politics, he didn't have very good choices in terms of the people that he could associate with. Yeah. So the other thing, too, is that from a Stoic perspective, if you want to morally judge a person's actions. Now, actually, we know very little about what Seneca did in relationship to Nero. Seneca never talks about it in any of his writings. He basically wants to avoid it. It's obvious, too, that he did regret working for Nero as well. There are a couple of quotes in the book where, if you just read a little bit between the lines, he seems to be talking about the regret of working for Nero. Certainly, he must have felt like he had wasted a huge amount of his time when he could have been doing something better,
Well, I just feel like that's such a messy area of life, though, like politics in general, and not just politics, but I think any time that you take on something, whenever you choose to bear a big cross, I think it naturally is going to come with mess, like just mess. And particularly when you're talking about something like politics, because politics is a weird thing, because there's always someone on the other side that's looking to sort of tear you down, make you look bad. And obviously when you have an emperor, it makes the, let's say, the decisions a lot more mono. Like you got one person that can sort of literally kill people and sentence other people to death. But I just feel like that avenue of life is marked with, not to justify anything that he did, but I don't know any politician who's ever had never any dirt on them, or it's just been a perfect, clean, nice journey, and they go through it and everything's done perfectly. It doesn't seem to be compatible with that line of work.
Right. And when Seneca started working with Nero, he was Nero's tutor, and Nero was only 11 years old. So Seneca had no idea what would develop later. Obviously, Nero was not a good student.
Yeah.
But Nero became emperor right before he turned 17. He was still 16 years old by a few days. And obviously Nero was not equipped to run the Roman Empire. And it appears actually that Seneca and Burrus, who was the head of the Praetorian Guard, together they worked together to run the Roman Empire. And Nero's mother, Agrippina, wanted to have her hand in running things as well, and that's why she was incredibly power hungry and had a lot of people killed and a lot of people's heads brought to her. She seemingly killed her husband Claudius with poison. So Nero didn't have a very good role model when he was growing up. So.
Yeah, it sounds like it.
Because all of his parents were doing that. Stuff, So we only do what we're learned, I suppose. If your mother's poisoning people, I suppose that's what we do. I wonder what lesson we can sort of take from that today, because I don't know, what do you think? Because I see a lot of people, I see two sides of this actually in terms of politicians, I'm thinking, because some people are really, they think of some politicians as literally a god. They think that they're, sort of the whole Stalin thing, like this is our god and they can do no wrong, so to speak. But then at the same time, I see a lot of people that are really perhaps overly critical of politicians. And like I say, I think I'm not justifying politicians. I criticize politicians' decisions quite a bit as well. But I do think that we have a tendency, particularly in politics, to either say you're good or you're bad, as opposed to recognizing the human underneath. And some of it is set up, some of it is part of that profession. But I don't know, do you think there's any lessons that we can bring in regards to how we view Seneca and that the messiness of that, and today maybe have a bit more compassion and understanding? Yeah, the thing that I always come back to with Seneca is that if you wanted to judge his relationship with Nero, you'd have to know what his intentions were, and we don't know that. So from a Stoic perspective, a person's actions are really based very much on their intentions. And for example, if Seneca stayed on with Nero because he thought maybe he could moderate Nero's bad behavior in some way, then it would have been incredibly virtuous of Seneca to do that, especially since he was in great danger. Now, it's just that, we can't document that one way or the other. As far as modern politicians go, I think this has been a perennial problem, and I've been studying this in different time periods as well. But it is surprising in a country the size of the United States with like 330 million inhabitants that we can't get better political candidates, especially at the presidential level. And I think a lot of that just has to do with the fact that the political parties have so much control. But this was one of the goals of ancient philosophers, was to create more virtuous political rulers. That's actually why Plato started the academy, so that he could train people so that potentially they could become more virtuous political leaders. That's what the Renaissance was all about. And Seneca wrote one work to Nero on clemency. And I've heard some people criticize Seneca for that because he flatters Nero in a sense. But what he's actually doing is he's holding up a model to Nero, and he's saying, look, this is the kind of ruler you should be. And if you did, then every person in the Republic would love you. And so if you acted in these virtuous ways, you would gain the love of everyone under your rule. And this actually became a very highly copied kind of literary format, and later on it became known as the Mirror of Princes. So the advisors of different political leaders would write these works, saying, and basically they were like holding up a mirror and saying, if you act in this virtuous way, you would bring peace and prosperity, to the land. So to me, that indicates that Seneca did have good intentions.
Yeah, I've always, when I vote and I look at politicians and who I want to support, maybe it's the Stoic in me, but I tend to look at their character more than anything.
Right.
And I think that's where I think, I guess I mentioned how more politicians are starting to come on the podcast, and I love that because it's hard, if someone's an asshole, it's hard, you're going to pick up on it in 3 hours, right?
Right, exactly, right.
And especially if they have logical inconsistencies in their thinking. If you have a good interviewer and they're poking them a little bit, as a good interviewer would do, it's the logical inconsistencies seem to come out really fast in a 1 hour, 2 hour, 3 hour conversation. What do you think about the focus, I suppose, on character and as opposed to maybe choosing someone who's saying, exactly what you want to hear, like we're going to do this, we're going to do that, and virtue signaling, maybe focusing a little bit more on the character, even if there's maybe a decision or two that you don't agree with, but you agree with their character and you believe that they're going to follow through on the promises that they make.
Right. I think you're correct about that. And I think that's the most essential factor. And I also think you're correct about when you make the observation that we really can't judge the character of politicians when we see them in like these 30-second news clips. So I think you're right that if we could listen to long-form conversations, for example, I'm thinking back into earlier elections, and people like, say, Tulsi Gabbard and Andrew Yang. Now, whether you totally agree with all their policies or not, obviously, I think my impression was that they had incredibly good character. And then you look at someone like Trump, and I do know some people who think that Trump had very good policies in some ways, but when you look at his personal character, obviously it was not good, and that came out in the end, obviously, with the January 6th insurrection.
Yeah.
Because obviously, if we go back to that Stoic principle of judging someone's intentions, he sat in the White House for hours watching this take place and all of these people be at risk, and he didn't step in to stop it, and he was the president of the United States. So, that totally marred his reputation forever, I think.
Yeah, and
Except some people still love him, right? So
apparently some do. But I suppose that this sort of points to, I guess, Stoicism as a whole, right? But particularly when it comes to politicians, like, why do you think it's more important to focus on their character? Like, why do you think that's even a consideration? Because it maybe I'm wrong, but it seems to me that most people don't think about that. They just look at, honestly, I hate to say this, but I feel like most people just look at what they're virtue signaling about.
Right. Well, unfortunately, the problem is that people don't really apply rational thought to the political realm. It's all based on, emotion, really. And so people have all of these different, feelings about political actors. And those are always more important, I think, than any kind of rational consideration. Now, maybe not for everyone, but for the average person. And that's what political campaigns are run upon. So actually, Massimo Paolucci has a book coming out later this year about this entire question and the search for good character in political leaders. So it'll be interesting to see what he has to say about that.
Yeah, that'll be interesting. It's I mean, obviously, and you mentioned this to me last time we spoke, but by being political, the Stoics meant it doesn't exactly translate today. Like you say, be political. They wouldn't necessarily mean going and being a politician. That sort of encompasses a wide variety of things. It's something more like get involved in the world around you. That's really what they meant by being political, right?
Right. I think in the ancient world they did actually mean get involved in politics if you can, but it was a totally different situation. And so obviously we can all impact the world in different ways, and that's what the Stoics would really want. But there's a big difference between being an advisor to a Roman emperor like Nero and being like someone who works at, like as a county clerk or something like that. So, but there are plentiful opportunities to, impact the world in positive ways. And maybe today going into politics would be one of the worst ways to do it.
Yeah. Okay. So we have Seneca. Let's say he's a politician of sorts, and he's criticized often for a lot of his political associations and mistakes, and he himself had some regrets over that. So to get back to this question, like, was Seneca a Stoic? So let's address the other part of this, which is often at least brought up, and that's that Seneca enjoyed and I don't use that term loosely, but he really enjoyed a lot of let's say intellectual freedom. Mm-hmm. And this is really appealing to me and it'd be interesting to know how this ties in today, because he actually criticized a lot of the philosophers of his day because they deduced a lot of the philosophical teachings into just basic logical arguments and morality and everything, and they seemed to leave out what I would call the spiritual aspect of humanity. And so so Seneca seemed to bring that back into the philosophy, at least in his writing. He seemed to be, obviously he was a playwright, right? Mm-hmm. Obviously he quoted Epicurus quite often. Mm-hmm. And he seems to tie in a lot of different ideas. Like he's not like, okay, I'm going to read I'm going to learn from Epictetus, or I'm going to learn from the ancient Stoics, and then that's all I'm going to talk about. He was sort of more like, I'm a citizen of the world, and I'm going to use what I can to illustrate the point that I want to make in a Stoic fashion, albeit sometimes maybe he ventured a little bit outside of the traditional Stoic teachings. But generally speaking, obviously, he's one of the three big Stoics that we have written documents on. He wasn't afraid to venture out and use things that might not be, at least not a lot of people would consider to be, quote, quote, traditionally Stoic, even though they are when you dig into the fundamentals of it. So, like, where do you think that plays in? Because I love that about Seneca, that he's not afraid to do that.
Right. Well, he was very open-minded, and he had a great sense of intellectual humility, because one of my favorite passages is he's talking about like the development of science, and he says, specifically he was speaking about astronomy, and he said that even if we had multiple lifetimes, it would not be long enough to study such a great and vast subject, and the people in the future will look back at us and they'll be, quite shocked by our lack of knowledge of the actual structure of the universe. So some people are skeptical from a standpoint of like intellectual hubris, and he had a certain amount of skepticism because he was intellectually humble, which I think is the much better starting point. But if you look at, and there's that famous saying from him that people shouldn't be like sheep and follow philosophical teachings unthinkingly. And he said, if a new and shorter path opens up, then I will follow that. But if it doesn't, then I'm going to follow the ancient road. So, that's a nice saying. But if you look at Seneca in practice, he really didn't depart from Stoic ideas at all. I mean, he had some criticisms of the earlier Greek Stoics, but they weren't incredibly severe. I mean, he respected them more than he was critical of them. So he was incredibly open-minded, which makes him seem very modern, but he wasn't someone who rejected the traditional ideas of Stoicism. He just thought that we should scrutinize everything.
Well, and I think that that's really what a Stoic does. Like if you look at let's say you look at the Stoic journey, and not just Stoicism, but anything you sort of adopt in life, you first start off as a learner, and so you learn the foundations, you learn the base. Hopefully you have a mentor that can sort of steer you in the right direction. And then eventually you work your way up to the point where you're proficient. And like you do this at your job, you do this in engineering and business, in any profession, but also in Stoicism. And then you reach a certain point where maybe expert is a strong word, but where you're pretty proficient in the foundations of the philosophy. And so now you're not just a beginner, you understand what the philosophy teaches. And then you're at a point in your life where you can use that, and hopefully, if you're really in this high regard status, you can even give back to the philosophy a little bit, meaning you can contribute to it in a positive way, or you can teach it to others in a way that makes it compatible to more people. Mm-hmm. And so I think that's what Seneca actually did for a lot of people that were, let's say, maybe more intellectually free or even artistic, like more because he was a playwright again. And so I think it's interesting to me that some people look back on Seneca. I'm overgeneralizing here, and they say, well, he has his own opinion on things, and sometimes he even admits sometimes that this isn't the fundamental Stoic thing, and he says, well, I can have an opinion of my own. And it's interesting to me that we look back on that, some people, and they say that means he's not a Stoic, because to me that means he's mastered Stoicism, and he's at a point where he's able to give back to the philosophy in a way and teach it to others.
Right. Well, if you're a philosopher, you shouldn't be doctrinaire about it, or just assume that philosophy is a collection of dogmas that you have to follow, because then you would be doing religion. You always have to critically analyze these things. And what makes Stoicism different from a religion is that there are arguments behind all of these different ideas that they had. And so, Seneca will give a lot of advice to like Lucilius, his friend, but he'll also explain the reasoning behind it. So you can test out and see whether you believe the arguments are valid. Another thing too is one of my very favorite images, which I learned from this fellow who was a poet. He said that our knowledge is like a sphere, basically, or a circle, and as it expands and gets larger and larger, then the circumference of the circle butts up against a larger area of things that we don't know. And so as you learn more and more, you realize how limited. As you learn more and more, you realize that your actual knowledge is more and more limited than you believed it to be.
Yeah, that was a huge humbling moment for me personally when I did engineering. I did an engineering degree, and so I remember being in the first year looking at the fifth year students and just being so not envious, but more I guess I just had this deep sense of respect for them because I thought, wow, like these people are engineers, like they can go design stuff. Like this is so cool. And I remember just high holding them in such high esteem. And then when I went up to get my degree, I felt like I didn't know a thing. I felt ready for the industry, right? Like don't get me wrong, I was ready to go and contribute, but it wasn't this like omniscient feeling that my perception of how they felt was not reality when I was there. And I did pretty well. Like I didn't just slip by. I did pretty well in it. So I did understand engineering quite sufficiently by the university standards, but it was still this huge humbling aspect to sort of realize that, like you said, the more you know, the more you realize you don't know. And that's why it's
Yes.
so important to focus on the fundamentals, because when you really understand the fundamentals and the foundations of something, you can take that and then you can apply it to all the messy areas of life, right?
Right. I had a very similar experience to you because in addition to studying philosophy, I studied the history of science, especially astronomy, actually. And when you really get into the philosophy of science, you become very aware of what our human limitations of knowledge are. And a really good example of that is that you can have two scientific models that are different models that explain the same phenomena. So just based on the scientific models, you can't really tell which one is correct because they give you the same results. And a really good example of that, which most people never heard of, is everyone's heard of Copernicus and the Copernican revolution and everything like that. And for creating like a cosmological model, they had all these mathematical devices that were developed in ancient Greece, like the equant, and I can't remember that there were like about 5 of these different mathematical tools. And so they ended up with this very cumbersome system. And a lot of people assume that when Copernicus came along, he got rid of all these clumsy mathematical models and simplified things, but that's not true. In fact, what actually happened with Copernicus's model is he just put the sun in the center, and he used all of the same mathematical tools. So there was really no change at all. He just put the sun in the center, and everything else remained the same. And they both predicted, the celestial phenomena with an equivalent degree of accuracy. So,
Yeah, that's
it's
interesting.
really a bit disturbing to think that you could have another way of putting this is that you can have scientific models that work that don't actually correspond directly to reality.
Yeah. Yeah, I made the same realization because we do that a lot in engineering. We use models. Like there's this ongoing joke people pick at engineers all the time because this is somewhat true. But what they do is they look everything up in a book. They have these tables, and it's like, okay, like if you were to drop a ball, there's this joke that if you drop a ball from the top of a house, the mathematician will drive himself crazy trying to figure out exactly where it's going to line up. A physicist would say, well, it's about this, but an engineer would go to the library, haul out the book, look up, okay, which house is it, which ball is it, what time of day, and then they would find it in the tables to tell you roughly where it's going to line up. So, we do that quite a bit in engineering. It was funny. I guess to continue along with the Seneca thing here, one of the things I love about him as well is the arts. He focuses quite a bit on beauty. I shouldn't say quite a bit, but he brings beauty into it quite a bit to get some of his points across. And I
Yeah.
think this is such a really important part of human experience. And not for everyone. There's some people that can sort of get by, some people that are really, really intellectual and they don't see a whole lot of value in the beauty in life. But and when I mean beauty, I mean the creative process, creation, looking at a sunset, writing plays, writing music, listening to music, sort of this artistic, creative endeavor. And I think that what I love about Seneca and what he did was showed people that you can come into Stoicism with one of these particular passions, and it can be compatible with Stoicism.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that's hugely valuable for most people, because most people have something. Like, I'm passionate about music. I love music. Some people love painting. Mm-hmm. And it's really great to know that that's compatible with Stoicism, right? Would you agree?
Sure. Yeah, and you do see that in Seneca's writings. He has this what Anthony Long referred to as a Stoic sense of the sublime, like the sublime in nature, the beauty of nature. And that's actually, for me, one of the most appealing things about ancient philosophy. And you find that quite strongly in the Pythagoreans and also Plato. Pythagoras called the universe a cosmos because the word cosmos means beautiful order. And so what he was saying is that the universe is beautiful, and that actually has a very deep philosophical meaning. And they tried to explain that through like harmony and patterns of proportion, mathematics, and things like that. But when you say that the universe is beautiful, that's actually a value. And what happened in modern science is that the worlds of fact and value became separated. So we just try to study the universe objectively without considering the fact that it's beautiful. But a lot of the world's greatest physicists said that when you arrive at a meaningful theory or model, it will actually be beautiful in some way. Plato said that beauty was the radiance of truth, and that beauty was actually essential in philosophy because it was like one of the highest values and helped us to understand goodness and the truth.
Yeah, and this gives me to something that I'd like to bounce off you a little bit, because one of the amazing things about many religions, and I think that maybe this isn't lacking in Stoicism, but it certainly doesn't come with this, is if you've been touched, let's say, maliciously by someone, like if you've had a very malicious experience with humanity, you're sort of, let's say, spiritually broken is a good way to put it. You know, you're in the quote quote in the depths of hell, so to speak, and you go to a Christian church. You can walk in there and you're just in awe about the beauty of the church, right? And then you see this community and you see people singing and you see people donating, and then there's this priest and he's telling you about salvation, and that it's really this. I mean, I've never experienced this, but I can imagine that it's a very spiritual sort of awakening and this sense of awe and this sense of this, I guess, deep renewing of your soul, so to speak. And that's one of the huge benefits or that's one of the things that a lot of religions do, particularly like Christianity does this really well. And I don't think, maybe you could call that the oomph, the sort of awe-inspiring oomph, right? And Stoicism doesn't have that directly. It doesn't really come with a song list. It doesn't come with a community per se. It doesn't come with a church that you can sort of go to, but it's compatible with pretty much everything if you use it properly. Mm-hmm. Do you think that's a weakness in Stoicism? That sort of lack of it's certainly a weakness in pure logical argument, because if you're spiritually broken, there's no logic, I can tell you, that's going to allow you to rejuvenate your soul.
Yeah. Well, maybe that's why person-to-person relationships were so important for Seneca as well, because that was something unique about him. Although Aristotle wrote about friendship. I just want to mention this briefly now. We can talk about it later, but it's very significant that every single one of Seneca's philosophical writings was addressed to someone that he knew personally or a friend of his. I think that's very significant. But I think that there's certainly more room for the sense of awe and beauty in Stoicism then has probably come down to us. There was a Stoic work written on the nature of beauty, actually, and it's pretty much influenced by Plato and the Pythagoreans, which, beauty was very important for them. And Socrates said that, it's the feeling of wonder and awe that is actually the birth of philosophy, because when you look at the stars and the planets and things like that, the mind wants to understand them. So it awakens this kind of sense of philosophical inquiry and the desire to understand things at a deeper level.
Yeah, that's so true. I think, well, part of that experience, I think, is, you talk about this idea of the cosmos and Stoicism and how we're all part of this whole. And I feel like you can get there through Stoicism, like just, let's say, following the foundations of Stoicism. You can get that understanding that you're part of the whole and you're one with everything. But I feel like you can, maybe to get to this, we can tie in the sage-like moments here, but you can get a moment of that, let's say the transcendence of your individual self and the feeling that you're a part of a whole, of the cosmos, right, of the world. You can get that through beauty. You can get that through, like, I always tell people, if you're ever sure of anything, here's a test of humility. If you're ever sure of anything, go out when there's no clouds in the middle of the night and stare up. And you mean to tell me you're sure of anything, right? And what that is that sort of this again, this transcendence of the self and feeling that you're part of something whole, and that really it's not that you're insignificant, but you're humbled by that experience, right?
Yes, I think those kinds of experiences are very important for us today, and they're important for society as well, because when we lose sight of the fact that we're part of a greater whole, and actually this idea that we're part of a greater whole was essential to Stoicism, but there's an experiential dimension to it that's very important. And so that's one of the reasons that, for example, I got so deeply involved in astronomy. And I'll just tell you the story that one of my greatest Stoic experiences was I was in my 20s, and I had this incredible computerized telescope, and I would go up north in Michigan where there was no light pollution. Periodically, I would take a little personal retreat and rent a cabin and things like that. And one week I went up there with the Meditations of Marcus Aurelius. And Marcus Aurelius talks a lot about cosmic processes and, seeing the world from a cosmic perspective. And that's where you get the view from above and things like that. And so I was reading Marcus Aurelius over the course of a few days, and I would take my telescope out at night and be looking directly into the heart of the Milky Way galaxy. You could see the Milky Way go up overhead. And of course, now we understand the structure of these things, which makes it even more amazing, because there are 300 billion stars in the Milky Way galaxy, and you can actually see the axis of it and the dust clouds, the dark rifts, as they call them. And the light from the Milky Way, there was no moonlight, but the light from the Milky Way and the stars was so bright that I could see my shadow on the ground from the starlight. And I think that modern Stoics need to think about how to replicate experiences like this, because there's a big difference between just intellectually understanding it and being able to viscerally understand it with your whole being. And so I look back on that and other experiences like that were very special for me. And it really makes philosophy come to life rather than just being an intellectual idea.
And see, I think that I don't think you can detach that from philosophy. Personally, I don't. I think it comes with the territory. If you want to be a philosopher and you're very logical and you want to be you're not really a philosopher. You're more of in my mind, you're more of a scientist. You're more of a, this is how things objectively are, and we're going to disregard that sort of that spiritual aspect and experience of it. And I know, you mentioned how can modern people sort of experience that. I think like music is a big thing, and I know you're a fan of. I know you mentioned Emerson, so I think you're a fan of Emerson. I love Emerson's work, but he wrote extensively on nature, on how you can go out to, like he described this. He has this powerful imagery where he walks through the woods, and he's no longer himself. He's an I. I can't remember the exact term he used, transcendent I or something like that.
Yes.
And so he saw himself as and he described the eye as a painter, like the world's best painter, because it will go into the world and paint you this beautiful image. And so he had that experience of awe and of being a part of the whole, just walking through nature. And I think that that's universally disseminated in most people.
Oh, absolutely. I agree with that. And actually, if you go back, science and philosophy, they used to be part of the same enterprise. They only separated like maybe a couple hundred years ago and became different fields. Science used to be called natural philosophy. And if you go back and look at some of the ancient scientists, say like Ptolemy, who was an astronomer, he was very heavily influenced by this philosophical idea of contemplation, which is that when we understand the deep order of nature and its beauty, it helps us to return to our, you could say, spiritual source in a sense. And so that's an idea that comes from Plato. And I think contemplation is very important, and feeling that sense of a whole. It's like I said before, it's one thing to rationally understand the fact that we're part of a larger whole that goes beyond ourselves, but it's another to actually feel it.
Yeah, and I think a huge part of it is harmony, right?
Yes.
And this is the whole thing about Stoicism. It's living in a way that's harmonious with the world and your own nature and human nature. But I feel one of the beautiful aspects of music in particular is that you can feel that harmony. I know you got a baby crying.
There's a screaming child somewhere around here.
It's all right. Believe me, it's harmonious. It's harmonious with the conversation. But there is that, like, one of the beautiful things that I recognize in music is I can listen to it and I can try and listen to each instrument playing individually, and I can listen to the singer, and I can listen to the bass and the guitar and everything sort of coming together in this harmonious fashion. And to me, that can give me like an out-of-body experience because I'm so aligned with the harmony.
Well, that's what harmony actually means. Literally, harmonia, the Greek word harmonia means fitting together. And so it's the relationship between the parts and the whole. Actually, you could say that if you wanted to reduce philosophy and science to their most sort of like singular level, they're all concerned with understanding the relationship between the parts and the whole. And I'll have to send this to you by email, but I made a chart about this because I was investigating Indo-European roots. And these are like the roots that words come from in all different languages, because there was a Proto-Indo-European language. And harmonia comes from this Indo-European root, which is AR, and it means to join together. It means to fit together, fitting together. And the words art and ritual came from that as well, along with a lot of other, and arithmos, number, and a lot of other closely interrelated words and concepts. They call those cognates. And so when you look at this chart with R at the beginning, harmonia, to fit together, and you see all the words that came from it and how they descended from it, that in itself is actually a profound experience to contemplate that.
Yeah. That is,
and it's exactly what you're talking about with music and feeling part of a larger reality. So one of the things that people say about Stoicism that is somewhat incorrect is they say the Stoics didn't believe in a transcendent God, and that's true. That's true, but it's misleading because the idea of Stoic divinity, or like logos, or the reason in the universe and behind the universe. It's immanent. It's within the world, and it's not transcendent like the Christian idea of God, which exists beyond the universe and drew up a plan for the universe and brought it into being. In fact, all of the Greek philosophers pretty much shared the Stoic view, or the Stoic view, was the same as the earlier Greek philosophers, that there is no transcendent God in Greek philosophy. But in Stoicism, there is a sense of the transcendent, or a reality that's larger, that goes beyond you. And you see that in the cosmopolis, for example. And even if God in Stoicism is not exactly transcendent, it's immanent in the universe, that doesn't mean that the universe itself isn't a transcendent order, because what transcendence really means, the way that I use it, is that it's something that goes beyond your limited self, that you're a part of, actually. And so I think it would be helpful, actually, for modern Stoics to maybe think along those lines, that we belong not only to a transcendent order that goes beyond us, which is the human community and the biosphere, but the universe itself. And in science, there's a scientific word for or a term for this. It's called the cosmological principle, and it's part of astronomy. And what the cosmological principle states is that no matter where you go in the universe, things are going to look pretty much the same, because the laws of nature are the same everywhere. So wherever you go, you're going to encounter the same reality.
Now, do you think that you're talking about this cosmopolis and recognizing your place in the whole? Do you think that in order for you to sort of feel that, you need to understand that? So I know it's a weird question. Let me give you an example here, or an analogy. So if you're in a kitchen cooking, you can bring someone in, and let's say they have no idea what cooking is. They have they've never cooked before, or let's say they don't even speak your language. So you bring them in to your home and you say, okay, I want you to cut up onions. So you put them in place, and they don't know what they have. They have no idea what they're doing in the grand scheme of things. They're just here. They're chopping onions. You teach them the skill required to chop up the onions. And then, eventually you take the onions and you do whatever you want with it. But do you think for people to sort of feel that transcendent nature and being a part of the cosmos, there needs to be the understanding that I'm not just cutting up onions. I'm cutting up onions that's going into the preparation of a meal that's being shared by the family, that we are all sharing this community-like moment that we're all going to enjoy, that's going to sustain our bodies. So it's sort of like, you can teach someone to cut up onions and they can have no idea about the whole cooking process. But when they understand that, no, you're not just cutting onions. What you're doing is you're contributing to the whole in a very harmonious manner. Do you think that understanding is really important to human eudaimonia, human happiness?
Yes, because you can't arrive at the idea of the cosmopolis without that. And really that idea for the Stoics that we're part of this larger rational reality. I gave a talk on this once, and the talk was why we're born to be ethical. And I really believe that we are born to be ethical once you realize that we're interconnected with, other living beings and human beings and things like that, when you are able to frame it in that way. And that's what you're talking about in terms of the cooking, is that in order to have these kinds of experiences, we just need to step out of our sort of atomistic self for a little while and, frame our relationship to others, in a greater way.
Yeah, because it's so interesting, because it's not if you're cooking with people, and I love cooking with people, because you create this harmony between you guys. But what's interesting is that the best thing for you to do as someone who's cooking with someone is not to chop up 20, let's say you're cooking with one other person. It's not to cut up half the onion. It's not to cut up half the other vegetables, not to cut up half the meat. It's for each of you to sort of take a role and then embody that role and do it the best that you potentially can. Mm-hmm. And that's what Stoicism really is. It's not about being everything that you can possibly be in the world, because you spread yourself way too thin. It's about what is your individual nature and what can you as an individual contribute to the whole.
Right. And that's exactly what Seneca wrote about as well, like the idea of the four roles and things like that, that you need to, basically everyone should try to contribute to the world. But if you don't understand yourself and your own nature, it's going to be very hard for you to make a good contribution to society.
Yeah, like if you cry when you're cutting up onions, maybe you shouldn't should cut up onions. I guess just getting near the end here, one of the things I wanted to touch on ever so briefly, and we can tie this in because this kind of fits in with this idea of the cosmopolis, is identity politics. And they tend to be sort of really ravaging today, but you mentioned briefly in your book how this is fundamentally unstoic, because what you're doing is you're saying that your group identity is more important than your individual identity in response to our shared divinity in all of humanity and all of the cosmos.
Mm-hmm. Yes.
And so, what do you think the antidote to that is? Because it is a rampant problem how we're so divided in many ways.
Right. One of my favorite lines from Seneca is that if you remove fellowship from people, you'll end up just tearing apart society on which our lives depend. And that's really where he's describing identity politics or divisive identity politics. Actually, the Stoic view is a form of identity politics too, but it's just the opposite. Stoic identity politics is that our identity is that we're part of humanity and, the brotherhood of man, and we're all interrelated to each other, and so we should work together and create a just, beautiful society. So this is I'm very concerned about the types of political divisions that I see in the United States, especially because I live in Bosnia. And in Bosnia, there was a terrible civil war here, which was based on ethno-nationalism, like about 25 years ago. There were at least 100,000 people killed and 1 million people that had to leave the country as refugees, go somewhere else. And a lot of the kind of nonsense that led to the war is being reinitiated today. So there are some pretty severe political problems here now. I don't think there'll be another war, but it's a very small country, like less than 4 million, and it's caused in just the last 6 years like 500,000 people to leave the country because there are no jobs, and people are just reviving these political divisions from the past that are just things that are made up, basically. And so what I want to tell you about just for a minute is the history of the city where I live, Sarajevo, because for 500 years, Muslims, Orthodox Christians, Catholics, and Jews lived together in harmony with one another. And it's the only city in Europe and probably the world where there's a little central old part of town, and you go there and there's like this old Jewish synagogue, and then like a stone's throw away from it is like the main mosque, and then just over to the side is the old Orthodox church, and then there's the Catholic cathedral. So they're all within like a 4-minute walk of each other. And people lived here, they got along perfectly. There were no serious divisions. There were no incidents or anything like that. And then what happened is that at the end of the 1800s, this idea of different ethnic groups was introduced. And so the people who followed different religions were identified with different ethnic groups. And then when the war started, 25 years ago, the politicians created all of this rhetoric to divide people based on their ethnic groups. And it's still going on today. It's like the war stopped, but the Cold War never did. And it's just unbelievable. And so the reason I brought this up is that if you know like a lot about the situation here and you witness this stuff taking place every day. And then you look at the United States with identity politics, the identity politics of division rather than unity. You can see how dangerous the situation really is.
And I don't know. I know this is a really tall order question, but like what do you think is at the basis of this? I don't know. Like, do you think there's a lack of spirituality, or a lack of like what causes people to make a few friends and say, okay, now I'm part of this group, and everyone outside of this I don't want to associate with. Not even that I won't associate with them, but that they are the enemy.
Right. Well, I think some of it has to do with biological evolution, and I know Massimo Pilucci has mentioned this as well, because in the past everyone was a tribal creature, and so the way that you survived was being part of a tribe. But then as human beings evolve intellectually and culturally, then you should be able to relate to everyone else in a more easy way. And hopefully those, tribes, we should think of human beings as being like one tribe, the tribe of humanity, because the differences that separate us are really so minor. And it seems like things are moving backwards in the United States, because I know that maybe like a couple decades ago, I was totally surrounded by people who believed in the brotherhood of humanity. That was just the normal way that people looked at things. And now there's so much divisiveness and pitting one group against another. It can't end well. So I think part of it is there's probably an inherited psychological tendency for people to be like that, right? And I think part of it too is that traditional religion has broken down, and so people find a sense of being like moral people, with a purpose in life, having a sacred mission by identifying, with different groups. And so we're going to fight for social justice, and that meets an inner spiritual need. And of course, we should fight for justice and for all of these virtues, but we should also fight for the idea of a common brotherhood of humanity that encompasses everyone.
Well, and I've been really dealing with this lately too. So I'm Canadian. I don't know if you can tell from my accent, but most Americans can. But in Canada now, there's quite a bit of division around. There's a huge trucker protest going on, and just a lot of contradicting information out there. But what I find rather shocking is how I can't even get people to agree on our foundational values. And I don't even mean like, what's it mean to be a Canadian? Like, let's be kind, let's hold, like, I'm talking about the Canadian Charter of Rights and Freedoms, which is very similar to the American Constitution. It's like freedom of expression, freedom of association, freedom of mobility all across Canada, freedom to peaceful protest. And what I see now is people are they're either shaming people for protesting, or they're shaming people for not protesting. And it's very disheartening to me, because I feel like if we can't agree on the foundations of our values, if you want to protest, because what's happening here is people are shaming some truckers, saying, well, you should just get back to work because that's what you should do for society. It's like, well, no, if we agree that workers have the right to not work if they don't want to, and they have the right to protest, that takes precedence over your opinion on whether or not they should. And so I'm trying to get Canadians to be more united, regardless of whether or not you agree with why they're protesting. You should agree that they have the right to protest.
Right. Well, they should have the right to protest. Maybe part of the issue too is that part of their protest involves closing things down, which has an impact on other people rather than just if they were just like on the lawn protesting. So that's probably one of the issues. I've been following the headlines, but I haven't read any of the stories, so I can't comment on that. And I wouldn't comment on it anyways because the news reporting that we have now is so biased and unreliable that with a lot of these stories, it takes a very long time to really figure out what's actually going on. So, but it is disheartening, and part of the reason this polarization exists is because it's commercially profitable. That's something that I mentioned in the book as well, because Seneca was the first to write about crowd psychology or mob psychology, and he went to the gladiatorial games, and people were screaming for people to be killed in front of them, and he thought, that's not a very good influence on my characters.
Right.
But that's what we're seeing now. So you get different, tribes, and then they become emotionally upset about things. And it's all very, very unstoic. So the Stoics would say you have to take a step back and not get caught up in these emotional contagions and, think about things rationally. And I do share your concern as well that we should have these foundational principles, for example, like free speech, and then you end up saying, oh, well, we should have free speech, but not on college campuses, or whatever. So
right.
they're always trying to modify things, but it's just part of the strange time that we're living in, and I hope that people will be able to come together more and talk with people who don't see things exactly the same way that they do, which is a very healthy thing. That's supposedly part of what universities should be for, is to have dialogues and debates and things like that, rather than screaming at each other and casting aspersions and things like that.
Yeah, no, I agree. I mean, one of the most appalling things I heard someone say online is, I mentioned the Charter of Rights and Freedoms, and they said, you mean the Charter of Criminals? They said only criminals look at that. And I just remember reading that. I was awestruck. I said, how can you say that our fundamental rights as Canadians, only criminals look at that?
Yeah. Well, there's a whole history to that way of thinking, and I made a post in a Facebook in a few Facebook groups recently that I got a lot of flack for, which was about how people have personal agency and how it's not good to think of yourself as being a victim, which actually is a very Stoic, perspective. But what I discovered is that if you now believe in personal agency, that people can improve their own lives, if you write an opinion about that in a large enough group, someone will come after you. And I was trying to figure out exactly why is that so? Where did this come from? And I don't want to get political about this, but the only conclusion that I came up with is that it's basically a Marxist idea, because Marxists categorize people as either being oppressors or being part of an oppressed class. And that's where a lot of this identity politics is coming from. And I think that's just terrible, because think about human beings, and think about being in a position where someone has to be either an oppressor or oppressed. What a horrible way to think about human beings. Right. And what a horrible way to think about yourself. I don't want to be an oppressor or oppressed. I just want to be a human being and have a nice, happy life and work with others, bring some goodness and beauty into the world, make the world a better place. If you think about people only through that lens, which is actually quite common, I'm afraid, you're creating a disastrous way of looking at the world with disastrous outcomes. And I think that a lot of this identity politics, comes from those kinds of Marxist ideas.
Yeah, and one of my historical heroes is Alexander Solzhenitsyn. Obviously, he wrote the Gulag Archipelago, and he was in the Russian gulag, horrible conditions, and he. I can't imagine the amount of fortitude it would take for you to be in that position and still have the strength to say we are all both oppressor and oppressed.
Well, right. I mean, you can look at it that way too. But fundamentally, I think it's a bad way to look at people.
Yeah,
I mean, even if there's some truth to it, right?
You mean the oppression? You mean the fact that we're oppressive at all?
Well, I'm not going to say that we're not, because obviously people have been oppressors in the past, and they still are, right? So people do unvirtuous things, but I just don't think it's I don't think it's a healthy way to look at things, and people unconsciously assimilate these ideas. So, for example, when I was young, I unconsciously assimilated some of these ideas, and I owned a book publishing company in Michigan, and I felt guilty because I felt that maybe I wasn't paying my employees enough, and that I was exploiting them. And where did I get that idea? It's just something that was like in the air that I unconsciously assimilated. But then if I look at it rationally, I was paying them quite well, because the place where we lived was a very inexpensive city, and I was paying people the same amount that they would have made as entry-level employees in a large New York publishing company. So they were actually being well paid, and I was just having, like some kind of, moral qualms about maybe I'm not paying them enough, even though it was like never profitable and I really never made any money at it. So I don't think those are especially helpful terms. I mean, maybe at times you can't avoid them, but
yeah,
I think it's better. I think it's better to have aspirational models of what it means to be a human being. So you should think of that. I have love for humanity. This is a lost virtue of Stoicism that was very important to like Cicero and Seneca, humanitas, and that part of being a human being was to care for other people. And so I think that it's much better to think about people in that sense, in terms of aspirational values, because the alternative is that when you start thinking about people as that, first of all, the idea that people are either oppressors or oppressed is insane. Okay,
right.
It's insane, because you're taking this incredibly wide spectrum of what it means to be a human being, and you're reducing it down to this binary category. It's like you're either abused or you're an abuser. That's a horrible way to look at people. But then go and look at the headlines on The Guardian newspaper, or any newspaper that you want, basically, because these are the kinds of stories that you see now. And sometimes you'll just have multiple stories about, different groups that are being oppressed, and they're trying to fight back against all of this stuff. And this is something that has been actually created. If you go back and look at newspapers from 20 years ago, you would never find anything like this. Or maybe like, one story. I mean, it barely existed, and now it's taken over everything.
Yeah.
So I find that to be a bit concerning.
Yeah,
because it becomes very it embraces this kind of puritanical and punishing spirit. So everyone is now looking for someone that they can go after now.
Yeah. Well, I guess it's a great point, and maybe just to sort of close things off, what would you say to someone who, let's say they find themselves in that situation where it's almost now like when they see a dividing headline, they get that emotional response, and they're part of a group, and they're so sort of categorized by anger, and they're in their group, and they're looking at the other side as oppressor, and they're looking at themselves as oppressed, as a victim. Is there anything you would recommend as sort of like a first step or a first little carrot to maybe open their eyes a little bit to a wider perspective?
Yeah. I would say what the Stoics would say is take a step back, because you don't want to become involved in that kind of thinking. It's not healthy, actually. And I mean, in one sense, everyone has been oppressed, like you said, and everyone has experienced injustice. I can't tell you how many times I've been treated unfairly just because I have a PhD in philosophy.
Yeah, that's terrible.
I mean, no, seriously. I mean, that puts you in a class of people that's like, if I wanted to get a job or something like that, it would be nearly impossible, because people would have like certain ideas, like you won't stay here or whatever. And I remember when I went to an orientation meeting when I became a professor. I used to be a philosophy professor, and the president of the college said that in his talk, he said, one of the things you have to realize in a university is that things are not fair. And I was shocked to hear that, but it's true, and at least he was being honest about it.
Yeah.
So the problem is that, let's say, injustices do happen all the time, right? And Seneca wrote about this, and he said that the way a Stoic should approach these things would be as if they're a judge or a doctor, helping a patient. And when a judge punishes someone, they do it for the sake of the person they're punishing. They don't do it out of anger. So anger, for Seneca, was the worst emotion, and he believed that you could arrive at social change without engaging in anger. And if people think about human beings as just being oppressors or the oppressed, it's just creating this, dualistic worldview that will tear society apart. And the alternative is just say, well, we're all human beings, and we need to work for justice, and we can do that in a fair and equitable way without engaging in anger. Mm-hmm. Some people really recoil against that, because they feel that anger is necessary for social change. But Seneca says that that's not true at all, and that basically when you become angry, you lose your sense of rationality. If you're truly angry, when he was talking about anger, it's rage, and it just like topples the personality. So you're not able to think clearly any longer. So if you want to improve the world, it's probably best to maintain your rational faculties.
Yeah. Well, and as a I've struggled with this a bit as a younger man, and I gotta say, for most people, I've spoken with a lot of people that have had similar anger issues. Most of the time, you don't feel good afterwards. You feel good when you're doing it, but you don't feel good about the things afterwards. So it's worth, like you said, taking a step back. I think that's great advice. Dave, thanks so much for talking with me. Listen, I had a lot of fun. I think it was a great conversation. Yeah,
it's good talking with you, and let's hope that people can take a step back and work through some of these issues without engaging in rage and anger, and think about things a little more rationally, because it would definitely make the world a happier place to live in.
For sure. Where can people find you? Your book, Breakfast with Seneca.
You can find, if you just Google Breakfast with Seneca, you'll find it. And I have a website too called Stoic Insights, so that's stoicinsights.com.
Perfect. Thanks again so much.
Good talking with you.
Until next time. Bye, everyone.